Thank you. It's funny you mentioned the law school thing. I kind of did it backwards, didn't I? I wrote a book first about law and the Constitution, and then I'm going to go to law school afterwards. So maybe that worked to my advantage, though, because I wasn't tainted by the academia, law people. Thank you for having me here tonight. Jim, I didn't get a chance to shake your hand, but thank you for having me here tonight, and I appreciate your attendance here. I'm going to sort of caveat or preface my speech tonight by saying that I'm a little bit weary of answering the objections to Article 5. It seems like as doing this as a convention of states and working with this organization, it seems like that's all we do is answer questions about, well, what about this or what about this? So instead, what I want to focus on tonight is a little bit of historical context. And I want to hopefully create an impression in your minds, an impetus as to why this is so necessary, why this is the way that is most likely to get the federal government under control. And I think once you understand those reasons, and once you understand that context, I think that the objections and the uncertainties become a little bit diminished. So at least that's the goal tonight. I'm sure that most of you have heard this quote from Thomas Jefferson, who said, "The natural progress of things is for liberty to yield and for government to gain ground." Upon deeper reflection, this statement offers a key insight as to why constitutional reform is necessary. Government will always seek to expand its power, and over the course of our history, it has been very effective in this respect. This is not a function of who is elected. It is a function of human nature, and it is a function of democratic government. The founders themselves sought to expand their own power. Even Jefferson and Madison, arguably the two greatest champions of liberty the world has ever seen, did things as president they would have considered unconstitutional before they became president. This natural progress of things helps explain why Jefferson believed that each new generation ought to set up its own constitution, which was somewhat of a controversial thing that he believed. He believed that government, in spite of the Constitution's limitations, would inevitably end in tyranny, debt, oppression, war, or a loss of prosperity unless there was a mandatory peaceful revolution every 20 years. This was necessary so that each generation would have a palpable stake in the formation of their government and a corresponding desire to see to it that their efforts would not go to waste. Only that type of vigilance, eternal vigilance, could ensure the health of liberty. Madison gently reminded Jefferson, rightfully so I believe, that a new constitution every 20 years would provide too many opportunities for the disruption of institutions that ought to remain stable and predictable. However, our course over the last 225 years has followed the opposite extreme. Not one time have we held a convention to consider the scope and structure of government, in spite of the radical transformation that government has undergone. Nearly all of the 17 amendments passed after the Bill of Rights have benefited the centralization of power. What's worse is that constitutional changes took place and continue to take place without utilizing the proper channels, without input from the states, and with little consideration of the long-term consequences. Let me show you one important example of what I mean. And I write a lot more extensively about this example in my book, which is in the back there, if you care to study more about it later. When one is concerned about regulation, war, crony capitalism, debt, or a host of other government problems, the discussion must begin with money. How is the government financed and what are its spending powers? For the first 150 years after the ratification of the Constitution, it was a well-established and generally understood concept that the federal government could only spend money on the specifically enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8. There were a few, most notably Alexander Hamilton and John Quincy Adams, who attempted to show that the term general welfare, as used in Section 8, gave a broad legislative authority to Congress. The historical record in the convention and ratification debates and in subsequent constitutional disputes, as well as our own common sense, could not make it more clear how wrong Hamilton and Adams were. In what might be called an exclamation point of misunderstanding, the Supreme Court in 1907 said this in the case of Kansas v. Colorado, quote, "By reason of the fact that there is no general grant of legislative power, it has become an accepted constitutional rule that this is a government of enumerated powers. The 10th Amendment, which was seemingly adopted with prescience but just such contention at the present disclosed the widespread fear that the national government might, under the pressure of a supposed general welfare, attempt to exercise powers which had not been granted. With equal determination, the framers intended that no such assumption should ever find justification in the Organic Act, and that if, in the future, further powers seem necessary, they should be granted by the people in the manner that they had provided for amending that act. In other words, by using Article 5, close quote. Nevertheless, it turned out that the pressure of using the General Welfare Clause to justify large government programs became too great to overcome. During the Great Depression, many generations removed from those who set up the Constitution, the Roosevelt administration and Congress set on a path of novel and far-reaching legislation in an attempt to revive the economy. These efforts, collectively known as the New Deal, were mostly ruled unconstitutional during FDR's first term. Infuriated and determined to get his way, a re-elected FDR pressed ahead with his program. He attempted to attack the court head-on by introducing his infamous court-packing plan, which would allow him to appoint as many as 7 additional justices to the bench in order to get his way. While his plan did not succeed, it nonetheless seemed to have the desired effect. In a series of landmark cases in 1937, the Supreme Court, particularly Justice Owen Roberts, inexplicably reversed course and began siding with FDR's New Deal. In one of these cases, Helvering v. Davis, which decided the fate of Social Security, the court overturned a long-held understanding of the General Welfare Clause by simply declaring, quote, Congress may spend in aid of the general welfare, close quote. These words amounted to nothing less than the annihilation of Section 8 of Article 1 of the Constitution. Without a vote from the people, without a convention, without input from the states, Helvering v. Davis amended the Constitution more radically than all of the 27 other amendments combined. In fact, it would not be an overstatement to say that this court decision gave us an entirely new Constitution. Before it, we had a government that could only spend money on a few enumerated powers, with federal spending averaging around 6% of GDP. After it, we had a government that could spend money on anything it deemed to be for the general welfare, with federal spending averaging closer to 20% of GDP. One scholar described this constitutional revolution this way, and this was a scholar, by the way, who was sympathetic to FDR's New Deal. Quote, these rulings marked a historic change in constitutional doctrine. The court was now stating that local and national governments had a whole range of powers that this same tribunal had been saying for the past 2 years these governments did not have. If the Social Security opinions are contrasted to the rail pension ruling and to Butler, which were previous Supreme Court rulings that had shot down New Deal programs, it is clear that the court, and specifically Mr. Justice Roberts, had shifted ground. This episode of constitutional history demonstrates why amendments to the Constitution are absolutely necessary to constrain government. For the past 80 years, our powerful economy has been able to sustain this monumental shift in government power and spending. The story now, however, is quite different. The tendency for government to gain ground has picked up, and regulations have become increasingly tedious and invasive, and their cumulative effect becomes increasingly burdensome. Worse still is that government spending is poised to skyrocket in the near future. Social Security and its children, Medicare and Medicaid, which would not exist without the court's ruling in Helvering, will result in a catastrophic tsunami of spending. Absent significant reform, federal spending will reach 31% of GDP in just 15 years. Right now, it's about 22%. With the vast majority of that spending going to entitlements and interest on debt. Every person who has looked at the issue, both from within and from without government, has said that this is unsustainable. Now the question becomes what to do about it. There are those who say that we should not attempt to amend the Constitution, that we should simply vote for better leaders. This line of thinking misses the point. The vast amount of government spending is not a result just of our voting decisions. It is the result of systemic changes to our Constitution by the Supreme Court, which cannot be overturned by any election or any majority of politicians. Court decisions such as Helvering and others like it can only be reversed by constitutional amendment. Furthermore, we have undergone undemocratic changes to our system of financing the government, which made it inevitable that politicians would demand more spending and that the citizenry would be happy to receive the benefits under a progressive tax system, which allows most voters to avoid the direct pain of the cost. The Federal Reserve System, concocted in secret by bankers and politicians for their benefit, became a linchpin of big government. This quasi-private bank bankrolls the government's projects, allowing politicians to avoid using unpopular tax increases. The public has no power to change this through any voting mechanism. Once the government had an unlimited source of funding and the constitutional barriers to overspending were removed by the court, politicians began introducing novel programs, convincing the public that they could not function without them. If there is no limit to government spending, then the only limit on government is a politician's imagination. In time, the politicians' selling points became self-fulfilling as the citizenry grew more and more dependent on government handouts. The paradigm in our political discussions today takes for granted that large government programs are necessary for the welfare of society. We are constantly bombarded with anecdotal sob stories about individuals who wouldn't know what to do without their food stamps, Medicare, Medicaid, housing assistance, subsidies, tax credits, welfare, unemployment, flood insurance, Social Security, Obamacare, and on and on. It is a wonder that anyone in America ever lived past the age of 30 before the federal government began these programs. And of course, it isn't just individuals, but corporations and entire industries pour billions of dollars every year into ensuring that government looks out for them too. The root of these problems are legal and can only be solved by changes to the legal system. To be sure, there are political problems that must be solved with better voting decisions, but that's not the issue that we're attempting to address with Article 5. No matter who we elect, Congress will still have unlimited authority to spend and tax. The Federal Reserve will continue to devalue our currency and worsen the boom and bust cycle. Executive agencies will continue to have the authority to make law without a vote from Congress. Senators will continue to be obligated to please the masses and campaign donors rather than the states as originally designed. And entitlements will continue to hang over our heads with little chance of significant reform. Even if we elected the most principled and selfless leaders we could find, these problems would still exist and constitutional amendments would still be the most likely way to fix them. It must also be understood that the very system of electing federal officials is a fundamental part of the problem. The 12th and 17th Amendments, as well as other changes, radically altered the manner of choosing the Senate and President in ways that undermined their independence and made it more likely that they would favor nationalist programs. Like a muscle imbalance in the human body, these changes led to other imbalances in the federal government that contributed to its growing power, not least of which was the diminishing independence of the Supreme Court. Senators and presidents, eager to please large swaths of the voting public, have unsurprisingly tended to nominate and confirm judges who are sympathetic to large nationalist programs. By judicial decree and by constitutional amendment, our Constitution was made more democratic than it was intended to be. The framers knew the dangers of democracy, and thus intentionally avoided democratic principles in drafting the Constitution. As the election of senators and the president became more democratic, the dangers the framers knew would happen have fully materialized, namely, a populace that has the ability to vote itself money, and a large central government dominated by lobbyists and special interests. It simply defies logic that we could reasonably expect to use a democratic process in order to take privileges away from the very people participating in that process. We can change government, but not just by voting for the lesser of two evils and sending one of them off to work in a behemoth system marked by corruption, politics, special interests, and to manage outdated programs which we are told constitute mandatory spending as though we have no control over the budget. Indeed, voting has little impact on most of government. By a large margin, the majority of our laws are passed by unelected bureaucrats. The central bank wields enormous control over the economy, and Congress has little or no incentive to change either of these harmful and constitutionally dubious realities. The system is changed by usurpation, by politicians acting in their own self-interest with no legal authority. The idea that we can change this just by voting is exactly the idea that Washington wants you to focus on. We don't have to sit around and wait for the right candidate to come along. It is not just new leaders we need, but a new system. We can make it so that it almost doesn't matter what candidate comes along, because we can drastically alter what and how they can govern. Our right to change government extends far beyond the ballot box. We, the people, can be the authors of new rules that clarify the purpose and powers of government. But we have a lot of work to do. So tonight, I urge you to get involved. Volunteer with the Convention of States Project. Our website is very simple to remember, theconventionofstatesproject.com, or excuse me, conventionofstates.com. Apparently it is a little bit more difficult to remember. conventionofstates.com. Call your state legislature. Educate yourself and others. We have petitions here that you can sign. There's petitions that you can sign on our website. And I just want to point out, Tom Sinyard is actually our coalitions director. We've just actually switched positions. I'm actually now the education director. And also Ed Goheen is with the Convention of States Project. If you want some more literature or more information or want to participate and volunteer, you can see myself or one of those two gentlemen. It will not take a majority of citizens to make this effort a success. That is one of the appealing things about Article 5. It is the state legislatures that control the process from beginning to end. But it will take a small group of well-informed and dedicated patriots, and I invite you to be part of that group tonight. Thank you, and I will now take your questions.